small traumas that I didn't want to face, that I wanted to sort of leave behind. And a new name was a way for me to leave those behind. I almost felt a bit like free from everything that I associated with my previous name. It was almost like a perfect chance to reinvent myself.
Tino Chakadonha is a senior account manager at Veritone, an enterprise AI company. His professional interest lies at the intersection of technology and humanity. As a British-Zimbabwean, Tino has experienced the introspection that comes from feeling that you don't quite belong anywhere, and the advantages and disadvantages that come with that, day to day and long term. Today's discussion involves Tino sharing his experiences with his name and deciding to use one of his other, previously much less used names after leaving secondary school in an attempt to reshape and reclaim his identity. Names enriched with meaning are part of one's identity and hold such importance. Welcome to That's My Name. I'm Maya Mitsko September Welford. What's your name?
My name is Tino Paddington Chakadonha.
Thank you so much for being on That's My Name today. Excited to have you as a guest. So I know that you used to be known as Paddy. So you and I went to secondary school together, and I knew you as Paddy for the time that we were at secondary school together. Everyone referred to you as Paddy. But I know that you now go by Tino. So can you explain this change to me?
Yeah, sure. But first of all, well, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here, and thanks for creating this space for people to explore this topic. I think it's really important. So for me, at the time when I was finishing secondary school, I think there was just a few things I was reflecting on, certain experiences that had happened throughout my secondary school life, and I just didn't like how they felt. I guess looking back on it now, it was kind of almost small traumas that I didn't want to face, that I wanted to sort of leave behind. And a new name was a way for me to leave those behind and kind of start everything fresh and hit the reset button on everything, basically.
Okay, that's interesting. And when you say kind of like the way you explain it, like little traumas, were they kind of during or at school, like within the school context? Were they outside of the school context? Both?
It was definitely a combination. So I think actually I technically went to 3 secondary schools. The first one was the same one as my sister's, which is in Essex, and I was essentially experienced bullying there, and so that was not a great experience for me, and I didn't want to stay there. And at the same time as this was happening, my parents were separating. And then it turned into a little bit of a situation where I was being bounced between them. And so the next school I went to was closer to my dad, before I was living with my mum, and then I went to live with my dad, and this was a school close to his. But whilst I was going to that, it was known that it was still going to be like a temporary school because we're trying to apply for the secondary school I eventually went to. But yeah, at both of my first secondary schools, I experienced bullying, and that sort of started this, I think, almost schism of myself, where I would move forward without sort of looking back and leave things there and sort of start fresh, because I think I kind of tried to do that at the second secondary school, but it didn't go well. And I probably kind of did it again at the last one I went to, but without going to extreme of changing the name I was using.
Yeah.
But yeah, at the end of the last secondary school, I think I just felt like I needed a bit of a refresh from everything that had gone on in the last sort of 5 years. So it was a
Yeah.
mixture of, it was mostly outside. It was a mixture of outside and inside school, essentially.
Thank you for sharing that. And then growing up, kind of before secondary school, were you always known as Paddy? Like, was that kind of the name that you went by growing up, and then into secondary school you used Paddy? And then was it only after secondary school that you started using a different name? Was that the first time you'd used a different name?
Yes, definitely. So
Okay.
I was going to church like every Saturday until sort of the end of secondary school, or when I started uni. So everyone at church knew me as Paddy, or the full
Mm,
version. They'd use the full version, which was Paddington.
hmm.
So yeah, pretty much everyone in my life would use that name, and
Wow.
had I'd never really used Tino
Mm,
or Tino Tender in any situation before that.
hmm. And talk me through kind of the process that you took, the decision process that you took to actually start using Tino. Like, was it like an overnight thing? You were like, I've experienced these things during the past 5 years of secondary school. I associate this with my name Paddy, or Paddy. Your name is such a big part of your identity, as this podcast explores. Was it like an overnight thing where you're like using a different name, or was it like a gradual process? Talk me through that.
So I think it started with my my UCAS application, or
Okay.
like my university application. So I kind of I just end up putting my my other name there, and it sort of fell from there. So that every kind of new thing that I needed to enter my name for, I just
Mm,
started using my other name. And I think I'd kind of thought about it before, and I've kind of thought about the associations that I had, and tied these sort of negative experiences with my other name.
mm-hmm.
And even though I had a lot of positive experiences as Paddy as well, but for some reason I focused at that time, I was focusing on the
Yeah.
negative experiences. And I think because I was looking forward to the university experience a lot, and I knew that there wasn't gonna be anybody there that knew me,
Mm,
or that I knew from before. Like, it was all going to be a completely fresh experience somewhere far from home. So it was almost like a perfect chance to reinvent myself, or to
definitely.
change, or to leave that other persona, or that I
Mm,
tied to that name behind.
definitely, definitely. It's really interesting you say that, because my one of my recent guests, Nikki, she spoke about how her birth name is Nicola, and she grew up with the name Nicola, but she had some really, really quite traumatic experiences at school, at secondary school actually.
Yeah.
And I'd encourage listeners to listen to that episode with Nikki. And she, after that, she is now called Nikki, and she refers to herself as Nikki. And like you, it was quite a conscious decision to leave Nicola behind. And now she's kind of identifies, and her identity is tied to Nikki rather than Nicola. So it's really, really interesting to kind of hear you share that.
Yeah,
Um,
that was a really good episode, which I related to that side of it. But yeah.
mm. Well, I'm happy you listened to that. So how does it kind of feel, or what did it feel like to introduce yourself as Tino for the first time? So you mentioned that you were about to join university, and you decided that you were going to go by your kind of other name, which is Tino. Um, how did it feel when you introduced yourself as Tino instead of going by the name Paddy?
It felt really good.
Mm,
I think especially early on at my university, I had a lot of really great experiences. So I almost immediately built up a really good, like, positive association with this new chapter of my life. And it felt really good. I almost felt a bit like free from everything that I associated with my previous name,
Yeah.
and I felt free to kind of almost explore myself in different ways as well. And the other aspect of it was that Tino is more tied to to Zimbabwe, where I was
Okay.
born, and so I almost felt a freedom to explore that side of myself as well,
Okay. Yeah.
because whilst Paddy or Paddington, it wasn't it was an English name essentially,
Mm.
but Tino Tender was a Shona name, and I felt closer to being to reflecting who I wanted to be, and just
Mm.
exploring both sides of my like sort of that identity
Mm.
under Tino.
I love that. I really, really love that. And you mentioned that you're born in Zimbabwe and that your name is a Zimbabwean name. Does it have a particular meaning?
Yes, it does. So the full name is
Hmm.
Tino Tenda Ishe. That
Hmm.
last bit isn't on any birth certificates, but that's
Okay.
how it's how, like, my mum thinks of it.
Okay.
And essentially it means we thank God.
Mm-hmm.
And the story behind that is that I have a few older sisters,
Yeah.
and at that time, my mum and dad were really hoping for a boy.
Okay.
And it was such a big deal that lots of extended family members and everything, when I was born, turned up to the house where my mum was, and everyone's was really excited and
Mm.
was having a good party. And part of some of the naming tradition in Zimbabwe is about how the mother, or the feeling or the emotions around the
Okay.
birth of the child.
Yeah.
And so for me, it was that thankfulness around me around me being born, and me being a boy, uh, which I don't know what that says about in different countries and different areas sometimes,
Mm-hmm.
and historically at times there's been a different value placed on a boy's life
Yeah.
versus a girl's life.
Yeah.
So sometimes it doesn't sit so easily with me. But
Mm-hmm.
um, yeah, that's part of it as well.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned that at the end of your name there's is it the did you say Isha?
Yeah.
Yeah, so and you said that it's not on your birth certificates, but it's something that your kind of mum put on there. Is that quite common?
I think so. I think
Okay.
in my case, it probably would have been there, except it's already such a long name.
Okay. Yeah.
I think, if I remember correctly, what she told was that she wanted them to write it on, but they basically refused
Oh.
because it was so long, and they said this isn't gonna work. And so
Oh.
she shortened it slightly, and so now it sort of just says we thank, or we're thankful, um,
Mm-hmm.
type of thing, which still has the same kind of feeling about it.
Of course. Oh, that's really interesting. Thank you for sharing that. Um, and then going back to kind of your name and adopting the use of Tino,
Yeah.
so we've touched on kind of how it felt when you started university, you've it kind of reshaped yourself, you've got this kind of new identity, you're using this new name, and it felt really great. Um, how does it feel when you see people from before? So whether that be like secondary school, you mentioned that you know at church you were known as Paddy. Do you have any kind of particular feelings, or do any feelings come up when you meet people or speak to people who you knew as Paddy?
Yeah, it's definitely a mix of emotions. So I have some friends still from secondary school, and
Yeah.
sometimes they forget, and even at first they sort of didn't accept it, so they just carried on using
Okay.
using Paddy, and yeah, I think it's almost hits me, like the memories and that persona sort of hits me. By this time, I think it's
Mm,
been so long that I'm quite detached from it. So
okay.
it's almost like if someone calls you by the wrong name,
Mm,
and I almost don't recognize it as me, even though it still is. It's one of my names,
yeah.
and I think I then sort of in my head almost go back to that place and go back to some of those emotions and feelings that those events sort of cause when I hear that name, because I've given it
Mm,
such a strong. I've tied them together really, really strongly.
yeah.
But I think that's been sort of less and less over time.
Yeah.
And I've had time to actually process everything, and as I
Mm,
become more myself, I'm not as jarred, I'm not as shocked by the emotions that I tie to those events.
mm-hmm. And you mentioned just there that some of the friends that you had from before you started using the name Tino. You mentioned that some of them kind of ignored that and kept using Paddy and referring to you as Paddy. Why do you think that was?
I think because I didn't really explain
Mm,
why I'd made the change, so for them it was just confusing and strange.
okay.
Um, I think partly at the time I didn't really know fully why I made the change. It was almost part of it was almost instinctive, and I
Yeah.
think the reason I used at the time that was kind of more logical was that it's actually Tino is actually my first name, so my birth certificate
Mm,
it comes first, and then Paddington's my middle name. So that's how I sort of justified it. If most people asked logically, but I couldn't. I found it, I think, difficult to define or to explain the reasoning beyond that. So then
mhm.
I could see how, from an outside point of view, it just seems like a strange thing to do.
Mm-hmm. And how did it make you feel when, some of your friends would, I guess, in a way, reject your name as Tino and carry on using Paddy? Like, how did that make you feel?
I think we're good enough friends that I didn't take it negatively.
Mm,
Um, I just took it as it is, but I continued to reiterate, and if I just continue to reiterate it, and sometimes would even tell them like that's not my name, or like not respond if they use Paddy or
mm,
something like that. So I
yeah,
think over time I've won them over.
good, good. And then what about your parents? I'm assuming this is an assumption that you kind of grew up and they referred to you as Paddy. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but like yeah, did you grow up with them calling you Paddy and did they have to also make that shift?
I think for them it was a little bit different because they were kind of used to using either of my names.
Okay, yeah.
I think definitely Paddy was they use more commonly, especially if they're talking about me with other people and things like that. But otherwise, they kind of use both names, and I think for them that explanation I gave of it just being my actual first name, they just
Mm,
quickly accepted that and didn't really mind, and almost probably were um took it as a sign that I was trying to get closer to my heritage and to
mm,
the Zimbabwean culture rather than anything.
mm.
So
Yeah, no, it's interesting. And what I'd like to understand is why was the name Paddy used in the first place, or Paddington used in the first place? So you've said that, Paddington is your kind of on your birth certificate, like your second name. And you mentioned that it's, an English name or a Western name. Do you think there were particular reasons why, like, you grew up being known as Paddy instead of Tino?
yeah, I think it is definitely started when I came to the UK,
Mm,
and
okay.
it was it was just a way of helping the assimilation. And because of the colonization of Zimbabwe, I think previously by the French and then the English, and a lot of it was sort of religious based. So Roman Catholics, Anglican priests would come along and convert people, and when they converted them, they gave them a new name, and it would be like an English name, typically like a biblical name. So it wasn't uncommon for people to have sort of middle other names that were English, and that then would help with the assimilation. For a lot of them that did end up going to the UK or going to America.
Wow.
So I think it was simply that it was a more kind of UK name, although a lot of people used to either think I was Irish when I used the shortened version or something like that, and think it was short for Patrick. So there was still that thing I saw where they'll assume it's short for Patrick or something like that. But I guess again, it still comes back to helping with the assimilation. That it was the shortened version was the name that they recognized.
That's interesting. That definitely touches on like assumptions that we hold around like particular names and particular types of names. So yeah, that is definitely interesting. So you mentioned that your kind of first name is Tino Tender, but you do go by Tino. And I know like on your LinkedIn it's Tino, like on email it's Tino. So is there a reason why you go kind of more by Tino than Tino Tender?
Yes, I think it's a combination of laziness and also allowing for some ambiguity with my name. I think, and this has been like discussed, I think, on other episodes, but names can definitely have an impact on applications, on people's expectations, and different things like that. And I wanted to minimize the impact of that. I think it's still kind of relatively unique shortening. I guess there might be an association with like Valentino, things like that, but I think I didn't want to have to write out my full name each time. That is a real part of it as well. But it also has the side effect of helping keep it succinct and a little bit more ambiguous with the origins.
And so have you ever kind of applied for roles or put yourself forward for like jobs using kind of Tino Tender, or has it always just from the beginning when you first started applying for jobs, and even for university? I know you mentioned that you started using Tino when you on your UCAS application. Was that did you just write Tino Chakadonha, or did you write like Tino Tender Chakadonha?
Yeah, it was definitely always Tino. I think also a kind of association with my mum saying my full name whenever I was in trouble. Just helped to. I didn't want to have to read it like that every time, so just kept it nice and short.
That's fair enough. No, that also makes complete sense. I know someone at work. She always insists that people call her by her shortened name. Because she says that whenever someone calls her by her kind of actual name, she's like, my mum only calls me that when I'm in trouble. So yeah, no, I completely get that.
Definitely. I think I can still tense up if someone says my full name instinctively. I will just get a little bit tense.
Yeah, like what have I done wrong? So Tino, what are you up to at the moment?
So I work for like a enterprise AI company. So things are winding down right now, but I've been helping our customers essentially get to grips with AI and machine learning and help make processes and things easier for people. One of the sort of newer things that we've come across or that we're working on is synthetic voice, which is essentially creating a digital version of your voice, of someone's voice, that can speak any language in different accents, but is still originally based on someone's voice, which is, kind of tying it back to the podcast. It's a bit interesting of like, if you have a digital self where you can give it a digital name, and then you can give it a digital voice, a digital accent, a digital thing, how people make those decisions, and how it sort of impacts the way they interact with different people. I think it's definitely going to be interesting to see.
Definitely, because I think even on the point of accents, people hold such or have, people have such kind of bias around accents. So if we hear, someone with a particular accent, so say someone's got quite a Western accent versus someone who's got like maybe a very strong Asian accent, for example.
Yeah,
like people do have a lot of kind of prejudice around that. So I think that's really, really interesting work. I'd love to hear how that continues. And how can people connect with you?
So the best place is probably LinkedIn. Just Tino Chakadonha on LinkedIn. And I'm not as active on anything else, or even on LinkedIn. But that's the easiest way to find me.